When the final games were played in the 2016 Rio Olympics, it was one of the most expensive summer games ever. In 2018, it was estimated that the total cost was over $20 billion, far beyond the Rio Organizing Committee's initial estimate of $2.8 billion. Rio had big stadiums, impressive athletic villages, and top-of-the-line training facilities, all of which significantly impacted the game's bottom line. But that big spending didn't just end with the cost of just hosting the games. The city of Rio had to pay for new subway lines, a renovated shipping port, a doping testing lab, and environmental cleanup costs in the Guanabara Bay. But just 7 months after the games, the once grand Olympic venues look like this. These crumbling facilities left vacant are the byproduct of a city struggling with debt and colossal maintenance costs, all from billions of dollars in overrun costs. Most of the facilities built for the Rio Games were not supposed to last longer than the life cycle of the games itself, but the change in local government left the venues in limbo, waiting to be used or dismantled.
Now the question of the venues, and especially those that are still up there in the park, were not supposed to be. They were supposed to be dismantled.
Cities going over budget when hosting the Olympics isn't unique to just Rio. According to the Council of Foreign Relations, since 1960, every Olympics saw significant overrun costs, all except one. The Summer and Winter Games have struggled to stay within their estimated costs of hosting the Olympics. Winter Games have done a better job of managing that. However, the Sochi Games was an outlier. And economists argue, hosting the Games does very little for the betterment of a city.
If you're looking at this as an investment, you don't want to make an investment in something where you have a 1 chance out of 10 to have the outcome that you're looking for. That's not a good investment. That level of risk is ridiculous to undertake.
While other experts believe that the games are vital for the city's infrastructure for its future.
Better roads, maybe it's metro, having a development of the metro, or it could be the having housing that's put in place.
As overrun costs become a growing concern, several cities withdrew their 2022 Winter Olympic bids. So how did the Olympics grow from its humble beginnings into a massive and expensive international event? And how can the Olympics prevent even more potential host cities from withdrawing their bids? In 1896, the Olympic Games became a truly international competition as it modernized, becoming what it looks like today, a biannual event with Summer and Winter Games. In its infancy, the games were relatively small. Host cities would use public funds for the games, with ticket sales generating revenue to offset costs.
The very first Olympic Games were in 1896. No women were able to compete in those games, and certainly over time now, as we look as recent as 2018, the games look a lot different, feel a lot different.
This is Dr. Nicole Forrester. She is a former Olympic athlete in track and field who competed in the 2008 Beijing Games.
The Olympics is like the pinnacle or the Everest of that sporting experience, both for the athlete and also for the viewers at home.
The Olympic Games didn't see a rise in popularity until the evolution of telecommunications. The 1936 Berlin Summer Games were famously the first to be live broadcast. At the time, only about 50,000 viewers were able to watch from a nearby stadium. By 1948, the radius grew even wider for the London Summer Games. 500,000 people watched live up to 125 miles away. In the 1960s with the Rome Games, they were the first genuinely international broadcast, reaching millions worldwide. By 1968, about 17% of the world's population had access to the games. Costs ballooned as viewership grew over the years. More prestigious white whales were being built to showcase a country's national pride, draw in tourism, create jobs, and bolster local businesses. Since the 1960 Games in Rome, both the Summer and Winter Games saw overrun costs on their estimates. Things began to get dire in 1976 with the Montreal Games. Andrew Zimbalist is an author and economics professor at Smith College in Northampton. One of the things he specializes in is the economics of the Olympic Games.
Famously, the mayor of Montreal declared that this was before the games started, but he declared the Olympics can no more have a cost overrun than a man can have a baby. Well, it turned out that the Montreal Olympics had a cost overrun that was almost tenfold over the initial price.
The Canadian government shelled out $1.5 billion in overrun costs in the Montreal Games, well over their estimated cost of $120 million. The Canadian government finally paid off that debt in 2006.
At at that time in Canada, we were under a cultural war of sorts. The other issue that happened is the price of steel had skyrocketed. And then the year before the games were hosted, you had workers walk off on a strike, which then caused more of a delay and then again added to the cost itself of hosting these games.
By 1984, no country wanted to host the games. Only the United States kept their hats in the ring for the 84 games in Los Angeles. It became the first and only Summer Olympic Games to have an operating surplus of $215 million. The reason? As the only bidder, Los Angeles had the leverage to negotiate its contract with the IOC, and the infrastructure was already there.
Together with the fact that Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States, arguably the entertainment capital of the United States, meant that they didn't have to do hardly any building. Basically, everything was in place. There was little building they had to do, but not very much.
There was such a surge in revenue that was derived through the media cover itself that actually went straight to the Los Angeles games. And so like the IOC realized, okay, now we should make sure that we ensure that we get that big cut of the media revenue that's generated.
The IOC saw the LA Games as an opportunity to restructure their television revenue distribution. Before, the IOC auctioned its TV rights to the game's local hosts, who were able to keep about 90% of the revenues generated. In the 1980 Moscow Games, the IOC only took about 10% of the revenue. But all of that changed in 1984, when the IOC took 33% of the LA Games TV revenue. Over the years, broadcast revenue for the IOC increased. The 1984 Summer and Winter Games generated $287 million and $103 million respectively. Fast forward to 2016 and 2018, Rio generated $2.9 billion and Pyeongchang generated $1.4 billion. But it wasn't just the TV revenues that skyrocketed. So did the percentage that the IOC takes. Broadcast rights revenues for the 2016 games and 2018 games were 73%. Over its lifetime, the Olympics has grown as more and more nations participate and more sports are added, creating the massive competition we see today.
We're seeing there's more sports that have been added to the program plan. So if we look at the games in 1896 and how many sports were there and versus what it's going to look like for Tokyo, it is night and day difference and vastly larger for these games.
But as the games become more expansive, the price tag of hosting the games becomes more of a burden. Before a host city begins constructing elaborate venues, putting in a bid to host the games itself can cost tens of millions of dollars.
All these cities would come together and would bid, and then it would be narrowed down to say like 5 other cities, and then you've got people within the IOC visiting, doing these site visits to help decide like where we're going to go, and then it narrows down to like 2 cities and then so on. This used to be a very costly process to do, with a very small guarantee that that city would be successful through the bidding process.
Just take the Tokyo bid to host the 2016 Summer Games. $150 million was spent by the Japanese Olympic Committee for expensive consulting firms, city planning, event organizing, architecture firms, and much more. Eventually, that bid went to Rio. However, Tokyo did have a successful bid for the 2020 Games, but spent an additional $75 million for an updated evaluation and planning. Winning an Olympic bid comes with a steep price tag.
The largest single facility that has to get built is the Olympic Village. This is for the Summer Games. This is the village that has to accommodate 11,000 athletes and about 5,000 additional coaches and trainers. In addition to having the lodging, you need to have athletic training facilities. You need to have tracks. You need to have weight rooms. You need to have other facilities. You need to have restaurants. You need to have entertainment facilities for the athletes. You need to have clinics, medical clinics. So you're actually building a village. You know, this is a full service village.
So what else needs to get built?
Then you have the Olympic Stadium, infrastructure, road infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure. Also potentially billions of dollars there. Security costs these days easily run $1.5 to $2 billion.
While both the Summer and Winter Games are expensive to host, the Summer Games are typically more costly and expansive. There are more athletes, more competitions, and events that require more specialized facilities. Winter Games usually stay within their cost estimate threshold, with minimum overrun costs. However, the Sochi Games was an outlier, and peaked at an estimated $40 billion in 2014 in its overrun costs, coming in at a total of $51 billion.
Since 1980, the average cost overruns for hosting the games is 252%.
For the Rio Games, it was estimated in 2017 that $13.1 billion went into hosting the Olympics, well over its initial $2.8 billion budget. Economists, however, put that actual number somewhere north of $20 billion in 2018. An estimated $2.06 billion actually went towards sports-related venues, while an estimated $8.2 billion went towards legacy builds, or builds intended to live well beyond the Olympics' 3-week life cycle. The legacy builds went towards things like an updated infrastructure, highways, a renovated port, and cleaning the polluted Guanabara Bay. Of that $8.2 billion, a delay-riddled subway line cost an estimated $2.98 billion, and the renovation of Porto Maravala was an estimated $4.2 billion. To meet the IOC's requirement of 40,000 rooms for accommodations, Rio had to lay out the construction of an additional 15 to 18,000 rooms, intended to be used after the games as luxury apartments. Nearly 5 years after the games, most of those long-term use buildings sit vacant. They're also expensive to maintain. About $14 million a year goes into maintenance costs for Rio venues. Rio's famed Maracana Stadium, built in 1950, which held the opening ceremonies of the 2016 Summer Games, had its power cut off in 2017, after falling behind on payments during a tenancy dispute from the games. After 2 months of no power and left vacant, the stadium reopened for football matches and concerts.
In all cases, and in all cities, not just Rio, the reason why the venues didn't exist before the games is because it didn't make sense to build them. Economically, nobody wanted to build them.
The IOC has enacted changes for cities who wouldn't have much of a use case for certain sports venues in the future.
One of the simple change is you don't need to build venues anymore. Either they're needed by the community in the long term, or you don't build. And if you don't build, you have different choices. You can have temporary structures, which work extremely well in the majority of sports right now, or go abroad.
Rio isn't alone with its overspending. Governments spend billions of dollars on these extensive upscale facilities, hoping for job growth or revitalizing infrastructure to become a new tourist hub. However, this big spending on legacy builds and infrastructure for the future is outside the scope of requirements from the IOC to host the games.
Where there have been problems in the past is some of the venues that were designed too big, especially for the after games, and too expensive. And let's be clear, this is absolutely not something we are demanding. What we are doing now to make sure that we don't have these problems, they do not repeat, is that at the time when we are speaking about the future games, like it is the case now in Brisbane, we decide together about the venue, the master plan, what makes sense or what doesn't make sense, so that we cannot be accused of any problems in the long run.
While Rio invested heavily on infrastructure that didn't pay off as expected, that doesn't always mean that big spending is the death knell to the city's future. Things like a newly established metro line can pay off in the long run. Just take the 1976 Montreal Games.
One of the greatest things that Montreal has a legacy from the games, is the metro system. And I'll counsel committees that are bidding to host the games to speak less about the sports themselves, because the general public isn't going to all have access to like the sporting venues, but it's more like the feel that day in and day out a resident of that city can really experience. The idea of new business development, new technology, better roads, you name it, whatever is required for that city has come into place because of the games, and but for the games, those things would not be in place.
As of 2014, the IOC enacted the Olympic Agenda 2020. It's a strategic roadmap for the future of the Olympics. It signals cost concerns, adapting the games to the host cities, it limits expenses on future bids, and establishes the foundation for a more economic and sustainable Olympics.
We reviewed entirely the approach of the bidding process to simplify it, to make it more collaborative as well. We came with 118 measures to save on the cost of organizing the games. Not the capital cost, no investments are needed, no constructions are needed, but just the operations of the games, 118 measures. And the third strand was to simplify games organization by allowing the organizers to be creative, innovative, not to impose too heavy requirements. We as IOC are providing much more ready-made solutions, turnkey solutions, so that you can reuse some of these over time.
But in 2020, the Olympics were thrown another curveball: how to host the games amid a pandemic crippling economies worldwide.
Guys, I want to bring you some news right now. There's something that's just crossing according to the NHK wires. Japan's Prime Minister Abe is set to propose a one-year delay for the Olympics in a call with the IOC's Thomas Bach. Again, this is NHK citing this on the wires. This has been something that's been widely speculated about, whether or not the Olympics would be able to go forth coming up this summer. Right now, though, it looks like the Japanese...
On March 24th, 2020, the Tokyo Olympic Committee and the IOC postponed the 2020 Summer Games. The delay tacked on billions of dollars on an already expensive Olympics, $2.8 billion for the initial delay, and another $1 billion in preventative measures against COVID-19. The Tokyo Games surpassed its original estimated cost of $7.3 billion. As of April 2021, it is estimated that the Games will be $30 billion. The IOC faces another issue with the Olympic Games. For the 2022 Winter Games, several cities withdrew their bids. So what happens if no country wants to host the Games? Well, the IOC got ahead of that issue by doing something out of the ordinary for the Olympic governing body. In 2017, the IOC forewent the bidding process and chose Paris for the 2024 Summer Games and Los Angeles for the 2028 Games, effectively placing a pause on bidding. With the IOC defaulting to Los Angeles in 2028, like they did in 1984, it can add a much-needed boost for both the IOC and the Games themselves.
The Olympic Games, 32 and 84, and now we're building on this very rich heritage. Whether the Games of Los Angeles will be transformational the way the 84 were, I don't know yet for sure. What I know is that the spirit of innovation has never changed. And what was in 1984 in this respect is still absolutely the case now.
While the Games are a financial burden for most cities, it continues to serve its original purpose as a symbolic event, making the world smaller as athletes from nations all over the world come together to compete.
That the Olympics plays an interesting and somewhat important role, at least symbolically. It's a statement that we can get, at least for 17 days, every couple of years, we can get the countries of the world competing amicably against each other on the playing field instead of on the battlefield.